I want to welcome everybody to our wrap-up session for our book study on language at the speed of sight. And you can see we have our author here with us today, Dr. Mark Seidenberg. Dr. Seidenberg will be answering questions that you submitted. And we also have Dr. Molly Ferry-Thorne back with us. Molly's been our Intrepid Book Club leader for these several months. And so we're glad to have her online with us today also. My name is Mary Newton. I'm the president of Reading League Wisconsin, and we've been sponsoring this book club. So let's get started. We're just going to run through the questions that you submitted, and hopefully we're interpreting these questions correctly. Sometimes it's a little difficult to tell exactly what you had in mind, the information you're looking for, but we will do our best. Okay, question number one. So this actually goes back to a presentation Mark, that you did for IDA Wisconsin in September. And you mentioned something about the simple view of reading maybe being a little bit out of date in your opinion. And one of our viewers wondering if you could just expand on that a little bit.
Yes, sure. First, I wanted to say hello to everyone and thank you for participating in this book group, and also to Mary and Molly for organizing it. And I really appreciate your interest. So the question is about the simple view of reading. And Molly and I actually have a post that we're going to be putting up soon about this. Look, the basic idea is fine. It's an interesting insight. It's something that people should know. Children already come to the task of learning to read, knowing something about spoken language, a lot about spoken language. And so their task is indeed to learn about print, and in particular, how print represents the spoken language they already know. That is a true description of the child's problem when they are beginning to read. They know about spoken language, their task is to learn about print. That's an important insight, and yet it doesn't actually speak to, well, how does the child then acquire this information? How does the child learn about print? What is the relationship between print and spoken language? So it's fine as a basic observation about the situation at the start of learning to read, but it's agnostic about what's the best way for kids to learn these about print. What's the relationship between print and sound? And the problem that I have with it is that it encourages the ideas that print knowledge and knowledge of spoken language are two separate, distinct, different kinds of things that are just independent. You learn about spoken language one way, and then you learn about print in school, and they're just unrelated. And that is not what other research shows. What other research shows is that knowledge of print and knowledge of spoken language influence each other. They are intimately connected. So the way that you learn about print and how it represents sound is by making connections between print and spoken language. And similarly, learning about print changes people's knowledge of spoken language. One of the things I see in a lot of discussions of the science of reading is that they treat it as a lot of components that are independent, things that you learn separately. But in fact, these two things are closely related. So, for example, I've heard about people saying like phonemic awareness, that's something you should be able to do in the dark because it's a property of spoken language and really should be taught, as a spoken language sort of skill. Again, it's missing the idea that what you learn about print, what you learn about spoken language are each influencing one another. And in fact, phonemes aren't strictly properties of speech. They're shaped by your knowledge of print. So the simple view, you don't have to throw away the idea, the basic idea. Yep, the child needs to learn about print. They don't need to relearn spoken language, right? They already have spoken language. But all the other questions about how do you learn spoken language? What about individual differences and what you know about spoken language? How do you integrate print with that? All of those questions and all of the subsequent issues about how things develop, the simple view does not address them. And that means when people are focused on the simple view, it could support a lot of different practices, some of which I think are really not very effective.
I think one thing that I've heard said is the simple view really isn't so simple. And one thing that I've liked is seeing using Scarborough's reading rope, where um, one domain of the simple view is on the top and the other domain is on the bottom, and it shows how all the component skills within both domains are intertwined with each other, but then how they interact with each other, and also getting that idea of development over time, so that it's not a static kind of thing. The
No,
way that
no,
those relate to each other changes as the child's literacy develops.
you're so right, and I'm really glad that you mentioned that. So the House's reading rope is one of the few attempts to visualize. There's a lot of things that get illustrated with pictures, and I find that usually the pictures are not really capturing the idea. House's reading rope was important because it showed how the parts relate to one another, and it had development. It talked about how things change over time. And those are things that are usually lost in a picture. Like, oh, there are these absurd ones that Molly and I found when we were developing this blog post of, uh, here's print knowledge and here's spoken language. And, they're like two circles that don't overlap. Well, that's not a picture that tells us anything about where do these kinds of knowledge come from? What are they? And most important, how do they influence one another? Because they do.
Yeah, I think that whole idea of how things influence each other is so important. And I I see the same thing happen as happens sometimes with the simple view, where those two domains are separate and never meet. We don't understand how they're supposed to interact. But I see the same thing occur very often with the 5 components of reading coming out of the National Reading Panel, especially when they're described as 5 pillars and they're put side by side and they don't touch at all. And it's not very helpful for understanding how does this all develop? How does everything interrelate? And um, how is this related to what you do in instruction?
Well, you know, I think we may never get past this one question because these are some of the really crucial issues, I think. Um, so, you mentioned the National Reading Panel and the 5 pillars, and um, I had a paper come out in a Reading Research Quarterly that talks specifically about the way in which the National Reading Panel report and the 5 components they identified turned into things that should be taught, and why this is a mistake. It's a mistake because the fact that those 5 things are relevant, and by the way, the report is 20 years old and out of date. Again, the report doesn't really talk, it talks about it a bit, but what's really important, what doesn't come across in the 5 pillars, these things aren't independent. When you're teaching kids about vocabulary, you're also teaching them about phonology, and you're teaching them about spelling, and you're teaching them about um, uh, they're learning about phonemes and so on. So uh, this is something that I'm trying to figure out how to deal with. On the one hand, documents like Simple View, it's 20-year-old paper, more than 20 years old, and the National Reading Panel components, those were important in their time, and there are some ideas from them that people should know about. But the science didn't stop there. And in fact, in the 25 years since, we've just moved far beyond them. We know about all the things that were left out of those early papers. I mean, if the science is progressing, we learn more. We know vastly more than is covered in those kinds of classic documents of the past. So I don't want to break people's hearts, and ruin things for them because, the simple view was an important piece of work and people should read it. But
And even, you run into people now who they've never heard of the simple view. Some people have not even heard of the 5 components of the National Reading Panel. So I think, it's kind of hard to jump in at a level above that because they don't have that base of knowledge. But yeah, I agree that, well, we could stay on this all day. We should probably move on.
I would just say one thing, which is Molly and I have been struggling with what to do about this. On the one hand, because people's knowledge of these things is, of course, varies all over the place. And on the one hand, you want to say to people, look, these are good places to start. On the other hand, we see these concepts being reified. They're treated like they're just sort of everlasting truths and ignoring, first of all, their limitations, and second of all, everything that happened later. So it's kind of like, okay, good place to start, but we need to be able to point people to other resources that can take them further.
Mhm.
And I would just add that, like, part of that is having a bigger, a whole picture. Like, where the things that we've talked about are all these little component parts. And one of the things that I see becoming a problem is that then people pick camps kind of and are like, this pillar is my pillar that, nobody's paying enough attention to, or the language comprehension side of the simple view, nobody's paying attention to that. We've got, and so everything gets pitted against each other somehow, even within the people, the community of people who are promoting the science of reading, which is really unfortunate because it just like perpetuates this reading wars, even amongst people who all have the same goals and maybe even have the same big picture in mind, but are just not succeeding in communicating this holistic picture of what reading requires.
Yeah, those arguments aren't helpful. We need to pull together.
Yeah. All right, let me take a look at our next question. Actually, this person asked 3 questions, so I'm going to kind of split it up. The first one has to do with Stanislaus Dehaan stating that he thinks it's very likely that dyslexia arises from a joint deficit of vision and language at the crossroads between invariant object recognition and phonemic processing. And so do you want to kind of comment on that? It's hard to know. It's like you're not answering a question about your own research, you're answering about someone else. So.
Oh no, I have well, I mean, we're all talking about the same question. How does reading work? And I study the brain bases of reading too. And have views about and done research on causes of dyslexia. So there's no question that reading involves integration of visual information, which is print, and other things, sound, and visual information about the way things look, the nature of the world. It is so it does involve these different modalities. And as I said in the book, there's a lot of moving parts here, and so if a person is struggling, well, it could arise from a problem with in any of these parts. And so one thing I reject is the idea that there's a single cause, which is what the statement seems to imply. I don't think that's true. It doesn't seem to be proven to be true. But the question about, well, is there a visual component to the dyslexia and to reading difficulties? Stan Dehaan is a vision scientist, and he has been looking at this issue for quite a long time. And so have other neuroscientists and vision researchers. And the visual system is enormously complex, and we are still learning things about it. And so no one can say, we just can't rule out the possibility that there could be a visual component to some people's reading difficulties. And indeed, I can, in the computational modeling work that I do, I can show how a minor problem processing the visual parts of spellings of words would have an impact on learning to read. I can show how such effects would arise. I could show how they would affect learning about phonemes and spoken language and integrating the two. The issue is a question of fact. Have people found such deficits in children who are struggling? And the answer there is there's a long history of research with many conflicting findings, and it has been very, very hard to find consistent evidence for visual deficits being a primary cause of dyslexia. It doesn't mean they won't be discovered tomorrow, but there's been an enormous amount of research, and it has been very difficult to trace struggling reading back to a visual deficit and to identify what where that deficit is in the visual system. Now, so my mind is open because we need to get to the bottom of this, and we need to be certain, and there's certainly much more we can learn about the visual system. However, DeHaan's own claims about what the nature, he's actually gotten much more specific about what the nature of the visual deficit is. And I have just a simple slide here, and I thought I would explain it. I think it's wrong, but I can tell you what he's talking about. And if you let me share the screen, I'll show you. So are you seeing my screen?
Yep.
Good.
Can you maybe do, we're seeing the small thumbnails on the side. If you can go in
Hold on.
slideshow view.
I am.
Perfect.
Okay, so here's what he's talking about. So this is a cup, and you're familiar with it, you've learned about it, and when your visual system recognizes it as a cup. So here's the same cup, but it's been rotated 180 degrees. And the phenomenon is that it's very easy for you to determine that those are the same cup, even though, you know, the handle's on the right over here and the handle's on the left here. So DeHaan notes that a lot of objects have this property. And what he says is, well, over the long history of human evolution, the visual system has learned to treat these things as variants of the same. So basically, you don't treat these as two separate cups. You have some more general representation of this information in your brain that takes into account the fact that these are the same, even though one is a rotation of the other. So you have a generalization that these are the same thing. And what he says is, oh, there's a long story about how this would be an evolutionary advantage to treat these as the same, even though the one has been rotated. If it was a tiger coming to you, you know, you need to know if it's a tiger, whether it's coming to you from this direction or that direction, it's still the same tiger. So your brain has learned to form this kind of generalization. And so then what he says is, well, that evolved in people long before writing was invented. So then writing comes along, and we have symbols like this. And your same visual system is the same part, you know, it's the brain, the visual system of the brain, has now learned to recognize this as an example of a particular kind of symbol, the letter E. And what he says is, well, look, your visual system is really biased to treating things that are rotated like this as being the same. But for letters, that doesn't work. So what he says is, well, these violate a very general principle that, you know, our visual systems have adapted to. So if you were to take, a visual system that's used to treating these as the same and applied it to this, what would happen? Well, you might kind of start to think that these are the same things, or have a representation in your head that would allow this to be treated as the same as that. And so in some people, what he says is, well, this is what this works for objects in the world. You have to overcome it and stop it, learn to block it in reading. And he says, well, maybe some kids don't learn to block it. Why would that matter? Well, it's the old visual confusions story. If you do that, then you're going to start confusing these kinds of letters where there is this kind of symmetry. And if you rotate them, this B turns into a different letter D, and so you get BD kinds of confusions. Now, that's a long story, but what it's saying is your brain has evolved to do something that's really useful for objects in the world, and writing is different. And we have to override this. And that he thinks the visual problem is that in the dyslexics, some dyslexics, all dyslexics is not clear, but in at least some struggling readers, they're failing to do this. And this is making it hard to identify letters, and it's causing letter confusions. That's a really great story. I don't think it's true. The reason I don't think it's true is because, first of all, writing systems don't have a lot of these pairs. Through the history of using letters and through the evolution of writing systems, most of these symmetrical pairs, mirror symmetry pairs, have been eliminated. So in English, there's like B and small lowercase b and D, and there's P and Q. I mean, there are only a couple of them. They've been pushed away, so they're not actually a problem. The second thing is, Dahan and his colleagues have published a paper in which they had some dyslexics, and they did perform more poorly on deciding. They're given a letter like this, and they're asked, is this a letter? And they press a button and they say yes. And then on some other trial, they're given a letter like this, and they're supposed to say no. And then the dyslexics make more errors, or they are slower to do this. And he says, well, there's evidence that this rotational symmetry thing is really relevant to poor reading. I think it's really a very big story that's chasing very little data, because actually making these kinds of errors isn't unique to people who are struggling readers, and they're not a prominent feature of struggling reading. And so the account of dyslexia that's based on this, I don't think actually explains very much about the behaviors that we really see. So it's a great story, and he certainly thinks it's true, but I think it's wrong.
Well, that's interesting. And I know, I spent about 20 years tutoring dyslexic kids, and they do have this problem. Sometimes you see they still have it in high school. But the thing that I've always heard is that don't worry about it until they get to a certain age, because a lot of kids have that confusion when they first start learning about letters. They'll confuse the B's and the D's and the P's and the Q's. And it's just, if you see this continuing, like 4th grade, 5th grade, junior in high school, and there are these kinds of errors. So I can see why I can see why it's an appealing theory.
Well, the classic story, I mean, there's research from Frank Valentino and others when this seeing letters backward idea was popular about 30 years ago. Researchers did studies to see about the incidence of, for example, writing letters backwards in kids who are dyslexic versus kids who aren't. And the classic outcome of those studies was that beginning readers and writers do make these errors, but all kids make these errors when they're starting out, and they aren't more common in children who are struggling readers. So they're not something that distinguishes struggling readers from children who are progressing in a typical way. And so reading researchers put this aside as having been essentially disproved. It remains a popular idea. You see it repeated all over, all over, that kids see letters backwards and they write them backwards and so on. So everyone does when they're starting out. Now, if there's a persistence, the question is, well, what's causing it? Is it a visual problem? Is it something about connecting the letters to sounds? What other characteristics? We need the full picture of that kid, that older kid who's making these kinds of errors, to be able to trace whether they're coming from vision or something else. So yeah, it's possible. This is a popular idea. It's never gone away. And Dahan, who's a quite famous and prominent brain scientist, has revived it with a story about evolution. I don't think it actually explains very much about children whose reading development is who are struggling with learning to read.
Okay, that clears up a lot for me. I'm going to go on to the next question that this person
Please.
asked, because in a way it has something to do with vision also. This is a question about David Kilpatrick. This person says, Kilpatrick states that paired associate learning for learning sound symbol association requires visual memory, while memory for words does not. Do you think that if we explicitly taught letter categories, explicitly taught several upper and lowercase exemplars for each letter, that would improve decoding skills? I'm just, before we go any further, I'm not quite sure that really represents what, when I've read Kilpatrick, what I got out of that was that he was talking about when you do paired associate learning, you can use that to learn your sound symbol correspondences, but he just draws this distinction if you're taught to read words not through any type of decoding, but basically rote memorization of a whole word. I'm not sure what the person is referring to, but maybe you can shed some light on that.
Well, I don't think it's likely to be what he said, because it doesn't really make sense. And what you're saying, Mary, sounds much more plausible. So first of all, does everybody know what paired associate learning is? It's just learning to associate two things, arbitrary things. Like when you learn that the name of the second letter of the alphabet is B, you're learning an association between a visual symbol and a syllable, B, a name. And there's actually, if you think about it, there's nothing about the letter B, the way it's written, that forces it to be pronounced B. That's just a convention that we arrived at. That same letter could be used to represent any other phoneme, or it could be used to represent a vowel. It's just a convention that thing we call B is used in this particular way to represent a certain sound and to have a certain name. So the association between the letter and its sound and its name is a pair. It's a pairing. It's an association. And it's arbitrary. It's just something you have to learn. Okay, so paired associates, psychologists did experiments in which to look at memory, in which they would give people lists of pairs of words that are unrelated, like glasses, shoe, light, rug, blah, blah. They'd give them a whole list of these things. One word is totally unrelated to the other word, and then they'd ask them to repeat them back, and that would be a way of looking at their memory. So paired associates, it's just a term for learning to associate two arbitrary things. Okay, now what? Well, learning the correspondences between letters and sounds, actually knowing that B represents a certain sound, B, that's an arbitrary association, and people have to learn it. Once you've learned it, then you can use it in many different words. You know that this B is going to be pronounced the same way in book and bag and big and so on. But that first step where the child learns that this letter corresponds to this sound, that's an arbitrary association that you have to learn. Now, it's not that hard, and most kids learn it without a lot of instruction. Okay, so that part is learning a paired association. There are teaching methods for teaching kids to read that applied that to words. So they said, well, here's a spelling pattern for the word book. Ignore what those symbols, the individual symbols represent. Just take this whole pattern, B-O-O-K, and associate it with the sound book. So what they did was this, like look-say methods or whole word methods, they used to be called. So if you're just teaching the kid, here's a visual pattern, here's its pronunciation, just learn to associate, learn the connection between them. That's treating learning about to read words as learning an arbitrary association. It's doing the same thing for words as you have to do for individual letters. That's a mistake. So the letters, yep, you have to learn the sounds that they happen to represent. But words are combinations of letters, and the letters combine in systematic ways. So, and the idea is that if you know about how the parts of the words are pronounced, it will be easier to learn to read because what you learn about one word will carry over to another. So if you just learn the word book as a holistic pattern, and you don't learn about how to divide it into parts like the onset and the rhyme, or see the three phonemes that are there, the initial consonant, the vowel, and the final consonant. If you just treat it as a blob and learn to associate it with pronunciation, that actually takes a lot of practice, and it means that every word is going to be learned independently. There's very little carryover from one word to the next. Whereas if you learn, for example, phonics, if you learn how the parts of the words represent sound, then what you learn about one word like book will overlap with and carry over to other words like took or look. So I don't know what Kilpatrick was advocating here, but the idea, there's a big discussion of this in the book, which basically says you need to learn about the parts and not just treat words as blobs, because for the reason I just said, if you treat them as blobs, then you're basically treating all of learning to read as rote learning to memorize paired associations, learning to memorize that book corresponds to this sound pattern and chair corresponds to this sound pattern, and you don't give the kid knowledge of the parts and how they combine across words. So it's a very inefficient way to teach kids to read.
Right. I think that's exactly my understanding of what Kilpatrick was saying. Like, you don't want to teach that way. And you walk into some kindergarten rooms, not as many now as maybe 20 years ago, but there was a habit of placing signs on things all around the room: light, desk, table, whatever. And it's fine if you just want to get across the idea that every word can be written down in written symbols. But if you think that kids are going to learn to read those words just by labeling, I mean, that's an example of trying to get the kids to learn to read by using paired associate learning, which is not very efficient. And it just seems like you have to tap out at a certain point. How many words can you learn that way?
Right. I mean, paired associate learning, I went into a little detail about it, but it's basically like what people mean by rote learning. You're learning something as an arbitrary fact. This letter happens to represent this sound. This spelling pattern happens to represent this, syllable or word. And people can do that. We do have to do that for certain kinds of things. But it's a terrible way to treat reading because it ignores the fact that the writing system doesn't work that way. The writing system actually has parts, and the parts actually are systematic. And what happens in one word carries over to what happens in other words. And so you want the child to learn about the underlying parts, which is far more efficient than having to learn thousands of words, just like arbitrary spelling, pronunciation, associations. So he's right about that.
And I think another thing that Kilpatrick has emphasized, at least this is his view, is that even words that are phonetically irregular don't need to be treated at the word level as a paired associate learning task, that they have usually just one element in the word that's unusual. And so you can still apply your decoding skills to those words. It's just that they're more difficult because they have one element in the word that's spelled in an extremely unusual way that you have to memorize. That's a new paired associate task for you to learn that. But
I think he's mostly right about that. That was the point of people know about the 4-part processor model. The original work was about how kids learn to pronounce letter strings, and what we said was, all those words you're treating as sight words, they're not arbitrary. They actually overlap with other words, and it's not that they're phonetically irregular. So if you take a word like have, it's a perfectly well-formed word from the point of view of sound. It's a CVC. It occurs in other words: have, having, Haverford. I mean, it's just a perfectly fine syllable. It's not phonetically irregular. What's irregular is usually AVE isn't pronounced AV. It's pronounced AVE. And your point and his is, well, and ours is, when you learn about have and you treat it as a sight word that has to be memorized, you're missing something, which is that it's not arbitrary. It overlaps with other words. And in fact, I don't think there are sight words. In fact, I think there are precious few sight words, because it's not just that have is a word that is regular and rule governed, except for the pronunciation of the vowel. If you look at words carefully, you find that they overlap. There are other sub patterns that they overlap with. For example, have looks funny if you compare it to gave, but it looks fine if you compare it to had. Or an example from the book was like spoon, spook. Spook looks really terrible if you compare it to book, but it's fine if you compare it to spoon. So I have a much different view of where the patterns are in how spelling relates to pronunciation about phonics, or what people are now calling orthographic mapping. I don't think these words have to be treated as one-off words to memorize. I actually think they can be taught in groups that support each other, even the ones that seem at first glance to be irregular.
I totally agree with that. And I think a lot of that depends on the teacher having the knowledge of what the patterns are. And a lot of times it's taught as a paired associate task because the teacher doesn't know how, it doesn't see the pattern or hasn't been taught the pattern. So how to convey that to the student if you don't know it yourself is a little difficult.
Well, I have to say we could, I have seen, teachers seem to have access to lots of books that are lists of words that are grouped in various ways. And sometimes you see, people trying to provide this kind of information, but how does this word relate to, what are its neighbors, as we would call them? We could certainly use our computational models to say, here's what the neighbors of have are, here's what the neighbors of pint are, here's what the neighbors of book and spook are. And indeed, that's kind of information we hope to make available to people.
Awesome. Okay, we're going to go on to the next one. If you want to just check on your screen to unshare or stop share, I think it would
Oh
be.
my God, how many of my embarrassing things about my messy desktop have I revealed?
All you have to do, there we go. Perfect. I'm no.
Oh, you're so cruel. I've now revealed all of the embarrassing things on my screen. Gee.
I'm not very good at Zoom. So, all right. So this person's third question really had to do with different letter forms, and would it be wise to teach several different formations of letters, like take B and maybe do it in italics and do it in Cyrillic and do it in bold and capital and whatever cursive? Would that be useful or not?
I think it's probably unnecessary because people are doing it anyway. So if someone should do a survey, I mean, I've looked casually. If you look at children's books, I mean, board books, I mean, picture books, and you look at the type fonts that they use, they're highly varied, at least in American English books. And so when you're exposing kids to those books, you're actually showing them that the letter A actually is written a lot of different ways. And moreover, you're telling them, oh, A, that's A, right? We're teaching kids about the alphabet and the names of letters and their sounds. So I think that we're already, if you're doing things like reading to kids and teaching the alphabet and song and all the other things that we do with pre-readers, I think that the problem is actually being solved. What I tried to do in the book was say that this was what's going on. Do kids need additional instruction to make sure? I don't know of any evidence because, again, I mean, is someone having a particular problem dealing with the fact that the A is written different ways? I don't think it's a prominent problem. I'd have to look to see if there's any studies of it. My basic answer is, if you're doing these pre-reading activities, you're doing this already. And so by the time the child hits school, starts school and starts reading instruction, most kids will have had a big dose of this. Now look, this is a place where individual differences and variability in terms of kids' early experience could have an impact, right? If you're a child coming from a background where you weren't exposed to a lot of books and there wasn't a lot of this interaction going on and there wasn't all this pre-reading activity, then that kid might have to catch up, yeah. So in general, no, I don't think it has to be taught. Could there be some kids for whom it's one of the many things that they're behind on? Possibly.
Okay, we're going to kind of shift focus here for a minute. There was a question about dialect. What resources are available for teachers to learn more about dialectical differences in America and how they're likely to influence reading? Are there any teaching recommendations for dealing with dialect in the classroom?
So I think I can speak to this a little bit, but what I'd like to do, if it's possible, is to put together a couple of links to a couple of documents, or if there's a way to just to make those available to people.
We can put it on our Facebook page, and so people can look there.
Because I was thinking about this, and I don't think I have the best examples right here. So one thing is, one thing that people can do, this isn't exactly teaching recommendations. One thing is getting greater familiarity with dialect issues and how they might influence reading and other things. One thing to do would be, there was an article about someone I work with, a prominent person in this area, Julie Washington, who's now at the University of California, Irvine, and is the world expert on AAE and related issues. So there was a profile of her in the Atlantic magazine in 2018, and that's a great place for people to get a lot more information, and it does talk about impact of dialect on reading. She and I did research on this, and it's a good accessible place to start. So that's in the Atlantic magazine in 2018. A second thing is, I think the endnotes for chapter 10 of the book have some other sources for AAE and reading, so you might look there. You can certainly do a Google search on, put this all in quotes, African American English and learning to read. It will come up with quite a few articles. Now, in general, reading curricula haven't, and instructional practices really have not dealt directly with issues about dialect variation and about African American English in particular. I should say there were some early attempts. We're talking about like 1970. There was a flurry of attention, a number of studies looking at whether speaking a minority dialect like AAE has an impact on reading. This was a long time ago, and for various reasons, the topic was put aside for a long time. People essentially concluded that dialect variation didn't have much impact on learning to read. This is a long time ago, and I don't think the research was by any means conclusive, but the issue was put aside. Now we have a lot more research. I know people aren't really going to want to go to the primary literature and read all the studies, but there are a lot of studies suggesting things like, it's not that the child speaks AAE that is an issue. It's really how much do they know about this mainstream dialect. In other words, AAE, fine dialect, it's an example of dialect variation. There's nothing remarkable about AAE. It's like an example of a variant of English, like there are many of them. The issue is you need to be familiar with the dialect that's used in school, and in particular, the dialect that's used in books. So it's not knowing AAE, it's not knowing enough about the mainstream dialect. And that's why Professor Washington argues that kids need to be able to learn to both of these codes. They need to be bidialectal. And the kid who can switch between AAE and the standard dialect or mainstream dialect is the child who's going to make the most progress in reading. And there's good evidence about that. So other overviews of the research or accessible overviews, I'll try to find a couple of others. It's really only in the last several years that people have been studying this issue again. And so I'm a little hard pressed to find a good overview, but I'll find one, and hopefully it'll be helpful.
Okay, and you do have some things in the endnotes for chapter 10 in the book on page 331. For anybody who's got their book handy, there are quite a few things listed there. There's and Julie Washington is just, she's so knowledgeable, and I know when I was training tutors, and one of the topics that we would cover would be dialect, because some of us had students with a really intense dialect, and it was creating some problems. And I would just, you can just Google Julie Washington. The Atlantic article will come right up. And she also has some like PowerPoint slides online that are really useful, that explain all the things that are different in the syntax, the grammar of the two dialects, the phonology of the two dialects, and some of the morphologies.
If you go to YouTube, there are probably several talks of hers there as well. I should say she she was consulting with one of the major publishers um, to build some material about AAE into the teacher's manual to familiarize teachers with well, indicators that the child is using the dialect and how that relates to the mainstream dialect and so on. So I think this stuff is going to begin being brought into curricula and instructional practices, but how to do it and what what to teach and kids' use of the dialect varies. Everybody's not the same. There's regional variance. There's a lot of issues to deal with when it comes to implications for instruction.
One thing that I like that Julie always emphasizes right at the beginning of any talk that she gives or any article that she writes is that there's no one dialect that's superior to another. And your whatever dialect you speak, that's your dialect. And African American English has all its own rules. It's not just that it's different. That's all it is. But I know that we did go through a period of time where people who spoke or wrote in that dialect would be basically corrected, saying you're wrong. Well, you're not wrong. You're just using a different dialect, and it doesn't mesh well with maybe what you're having to read in school. It makes an extra hurdle for kids who come in. They have to learn something extra.
Well, they do that, and this has really been something I've written a lot about. It's not a level playing field. If one kid is coming in with one dialect, I mean, the child who uses the so-called mainstream dialect in the home and then learns to read, and that dialect is used in school, and that's a simpler situation than when a child is speaking a different dialect in the home and then goes to school and has to learn second dialect. It's almost like learning to be bilingual. The thing is, there's a vast amount of confusion about dialect and dialect variation, and it has an impact on teaching because I don't think teachers are getting a clear message about what to do. So you're right. AAE is unremarkable. It's a variant of a dialect of English. Everyone speaks a dialect of English, and that just happens to be one spoken by a particular group. There are others spoken by other groups. This is true about English around the world. The thing is, AAE is what they call a low status dialect. It doesn't have a written form, and it's not used in business or government or education. It's a dialect spoken by a community. It's linguistically like other dialects, spoken dialects. It's not that there's anything wrong with it linguistically or wrong with a child who speaks the dialect. It's perfectly fine. It works fine. It's unremarkable. It's just not the dialect that's used in all these other contexts that we think are important, like education. And kids can cope with the fact that there's dialect variation. It can be built into their school experience. It can be built into education, but we haven't done a good job with it. And so teachers really are in a quandary. They don't know. So they've learned that the dialect is valid, which it is. They learned that dialect is part of the individual's culture, which it is. And then when the child is using dialect in the AAE, for example, in the classroom, they don't know whether to correct it or not. Should they? And indeed, many teachers, particularly white teachers, will feel like it's not my job to impose my language on this child. Well, that is a deep issue. That is a serious ethical question, given that the child needs to learn the standard dialect because that's what books are written in, that's what the discourse, that's what the language, the dialect of businesses and government and so on, healthcare and so on. The child's going to be disadvantaged if they don't have mastery of that. On the other hand, they're right. You don't want to convey to the kid that the way they're speaking is defective. It's not defective. It's a situation that requires the kid to be able to learn both dialects. Again, the interview with Julie, profile of Julie in the Atlantic talks about this a lot. These are very, very important issues. They're sensitive issues. They're ones in which all the speakers of the dialect people who are speakers of the dialect have to be participants in the conversation, and we haven't dealt adequately with it. And it makes things harder systematically more difficult for certain kids.
Okay, we're going to move on to our next question. And this is right in my comfort zone because this is a question about the time that I grew up in. It says, has there ever been a time in history of American education where phonics was taught roughly the way reading research indicates it should be taught? Was the era of Dick and Jane a good example? I can tell you, I lived through Dick and Jane. No. Well, I mean, it's the one thing that I would say, I mean, that was, as you said earlier, that's a whole word method or look say. And I know that I learned some phonics back in the early 50s, but I think it was through spelling. The more I thought about it, I got whatever phonics I got, it was through spelling. The books that I had, I learned how to read the word sometimes because that was the long word in the book. You know, there was no discussion about learning sound symbol correspondences. We memorized whole words, but then our spelling lessons were sequenced. It was a nice phonics sequence looking back on it, and that's, I'm sure, where I learned how to read.
Yeah, all true. I mean, really interesting. And so looking at the different curricula that have been used over the years is fascinating because there were different phases. So, the McGuffey readers, which people have heard about, had a lot of what we would now call phonics in there. There were all these word families, and that were grouped together because they were pronounced similarly, and so on. I'm not advocating the use of the McGuffey readers. I'm just pointing out there was an early era in which they incorporated some of this kind of instruction. Then there was a backlash against that because some people said, oh, this is an inefficient way to read. You should read visually and learn to associate spellings with meaning because reading is about meaning. So then people stopped teaching that stuff. Then there was why Johnny can't read. Why can't Johnny read? Because he didn't know phonics. This has gone back and forth. So the Dick and Jane were in a period where people emphasized a small number of words that were repeated a lot and that the kid would learn to recognize them as visual patterns. And we were just talking 20 minutes ago about why that's kind of going to make it harder to learn to read, even though we did manage. The thing about the question is, the person was asking whether there was ever an era in which people taught phonics, spelling sound correspondences, the way reading science says they should. What the reading science says is that it's important. It talks about what the knowledge is. It talks about its role. It talks about impairments and their impact. It talks about, there's lots of evidence for the role of phonology and the integration of spelling and phonology in reading. It's very clear about the need. The best way to teach this material is a different issue. What is the best way to teach this material? There are a lot of phonics curricula out there and they do things different ways. So I don't think there was a golden era in which people taught phonics the way reading science says that should be taught. We still need to figure out what the most efficient way is to teach this material. I don't think we've got there yet. There were earlier eras in which, yes, there was greater emphasis on phonics. The term phonics is really old. It's like 19th century. So I don't think we've reached the perfect, I think we can still do better in terms of how we teach this material.
Yeah, I think we always have to remember that there's a distinction between what research tells us we need to teach and the kids need to learn, versus how can we do that most effectively. And we don't have a lot of definite answers on that second question. So this is kind of related back when in the more phonetically oriented reading curricula, very often you see decodable text used as a way to move from isolated learning of sound symbol correspondences and decoding individual words and moving it into text and practicing in the context of text, to let the kids know this is where we're going. You know, we're not just going to read individual words. So somebody had asked that she had inherited a classroom with some dusty boxes filled with decodable texts and wondered basically if there was, what's the evidence for the validity of using decodable text as opposed to not using it, or using predictable text or uncontrolled text?
Honestly, I can't say, because it's a certain kind of research in which you know, it's a very difficult kind of research to do. Trying to compare, to do a real study in which you can really home in on whether using decodable text versus some other kind of text helps or not. Controlling for everything else that's going on is very hard. So it's not a question that I have studied, and I don't actually know that the evidence is decisive. The issue, I mean, the question is, kids need to learn to read text. Reading books, reading text is the goal. It's not learning about phonemes, and it's not learning phonics. Those are all in the service of the big goal, which is reading text. So you want to have kids interested in text and reading text and succeeding for the most part when they're reading. How do you do that? I don't know. I mean, every commercial curriculum has an answer to that. They provide supplementary books. They have their own, they make their own assumptions about what's best. What's most effective? I can't really say based on my understanding of the research literature. I can understand guess what the trade-offs are. You know, the problem is you can write texts that are used for instructional purposes that are really boring. And also, one thing we noticed in looking at one of the major commercial curricula is the things that were being taught in the class that week, like phonics, for example, and the things that were being represented in the companion books that were supposed to be used that week were not related. That is, the things that were being taught in the class didn't necessarily carry over. The kid didn't get practice with them in the books that were tied to that week's lessons, so that week's material. So I can't say the idea that kids need to read, that they need to get the success in reading, that they need to build up the reading kind of muscle, means that there need to be texts that go along with whatever else is being taught. Which texts are best? I can't say. It depends. It depends on what else are you teaching, and what other opportunities do they have, and other stuff.
Yeah, it is pretty alarming when you see the programs where what they're learning in phonics and in spelling bears no relationship at all to what's in the text that they're reading. And also you do see even text that's labeled as decodable. I think one of the old decodable texts that's been around for a while tends to be pretty boring. Some of the new stuff is actually quite a bit better. I think that's one thing that phonics people learned from whole language people is that we need to make this a little more interesting and have more interesting characters, more diverse characters. And so I think it's improved a lot. But one thing that I see is decodable text now has, just like leveled text is, it's become part of the jargon, and people will stop in, for instance, to our children's section of our local library, and they'll say, I need decodable text, or I need leveled text, whatever it is that their school is telling them that they need. And then what they don't understand about decodable text is you can have a decodable series, but any particular book in that series is not decodable for a particular child unless they've learned those concepts. And so it's not the fact that the series is decodable that makes it decodable, it's whether it matches what that student has already learned. So there's a lot to learn about decodable text, I think.
Yeah.
I personally find it really useful, and for some kids who are so far behind on reading, it's the first thing they've ever actually been able to read on their own, and it makes a big turnaround in attitude and motivation.
I think that's really a crucial point. So I mean, on one end, on the other end, you know, you can say, well, these books are boring and you can't, this is not the way to build kids' motivation. And I grant that they may be improving and so on. But think about the other end. You know, what's motivating? What's motivating is success. You know, being able to read, successfully reading, gaining some control over it, and gaining some independence. And so if these books or any books are promoting that kind of experience, allowing the kid to have that kind of experience, that's going to have enormous benefits, and of course it's justified. So, you know, it's like a lot of other things. It's not like a black and
white. Boring too, right? I mean, we as adults look at that text and say, well, that must be like so unexciting to read. But if like Mary's saying, you've never read a book before, that's going to be like, who cares if it's about Dick and Jane or Bob and Tom? Like,
oh, so, Molly, that's such a yeah. So
and the point is that, right, that's boring, and that the point is then to move them along, you know, so that they're not, as soon as it becomes boring to them, they're ready to move on to the next book.
That's right. And you always want, I mean, it's this zone of proximal development thing, right? Which you do want the thing to be a little bit over their level, but not so much that they get bogged down. That's the thing you're trying to titrate. But the funny thing you reminded me of was, okay, I'm old enough, like Mary, I did learn to read using Dick and Jane books. And so now I read, of course, there's lots of criticisms of Dick and Jane books. Among other things, they were just pathetically, oh my God, little white children, and there were problems with those books. However, lots of people say, oh, those books are so boring. See, spot, run, spot, run. Oh, look, puff. I mean, I got to tell you something. I really didn't find those books boring. I like them, and I like the pictures too. They were nice watercolors, you know. They were pretty. So yeah. Probably want to put yourself in the head of a 5-year-old, you know?
It's so hard to, I mean, I think that's one of the hard tasks of being an adult teaching reading. It's just that we've succeeded in reading. So we've got this idea of what reading is, and this is kind of an overarching thing I've been thinking about a lot recently, is it's just really hard to put yourself in the shoes of that kid who's learning to read and remember what it was actually really like to grasp it, and what the experiences that they're having. It might be very different than what you think it is.
Yeah, I look back on those books too, and they look just god awful. But when I was in first grade, I loved those books.
Right.
When we finished a book, we got to take it home, and I would stop at the bus stop, and every neighbor I met on the way home, I would make them sit down and I'd read them that book. And part of it is like, as a little kid, now you have power over something, and it's like, I can control this text. I have the power over it. And it's just, it's really is, well, it's an empowering thing. All right, so let's see what we've got here coming up next. Okay, somebody asked about surface dyslexia, sometimes called it called a bunch of different things, and I've seen it defined differently in different places. Sometimes it's called orthographic dyslexia. So I'm always, when people ask questions about this, I'm always a little unsure what they're referring to, because it depends where they got the term from, how it was defined. But this person said, I'd like to know more about orthographic or surface dyslexia. How can words become part of long-term memory? How can they be retrieved some days and other days not? What strategies are most effective?
Oh, well, I'll try to keep this short. So in the neuropsychology literature, where people are studying people who were able to read, but had a brain injury of some sort, like a stroke, that caused brain damage that affected their ability to read. There's a certain kind of brain injury that produces a particular pattern of impairment called surface dyslexia. This is a consequence of brain damage. And I should say, brain damage is messy, and patients vary in the severity of the injury and recovery from the injury and so on. There's a lot of variability. But so what neuropsychologists do is they look at the clearest cases. So the clearest cases of surface dyslexia are like this. The person can still look at words and read aloud. So their reading aloud is very accurate. And if you give them nonsense words, novel spelling patterns to sound out, they can still sound out those things like N-U-S-T. They'll say nust. In the purest cases, the errors that they make are specific to words that have unusual spelling sound correspondences that are relatively low frequency. That is, words that aren't used very often that have irregular pronunciations. So a word like broad, for example, which, you know, it's a word and people know it. It has an atypical kind of pronunciation. So a pure surface dyslexic will, if you give them the word road, they can pronounce it. If you give them B-O-A-D, they can pronounce it bode. But if you give them B-R-O-A-D, they mispronounce it. And indeed, in the extreme cases, a person with surface dyslexic will look at a word like that and say, refuse to say it because they can't pronounce it. So what's happening? It's basically a case in which their knowledge of spelling sound correspondences is pretty intact. So the person can still sound out simple words, and they can still sound out simple non-words. But another part of that triangle is missing, namely the part that goes from spelling to meaning to pronunciation. So for the word broad, it's not just that you need to know that have the spelling to phonology, orthography to phonology part. You also need the contributions from meaning. So we have this idea of the division of labor where the two parts of this triangle work together. And the part that goes from orthography, spelling to meaning to pronunciation is specifically related to lower frequency words with uncommon pronunciations, spelling sound correspondences. So when you look at skilled readers, they use both of these pathways, and the semantic part is really relevant to these certain kinds of words. In surface dyslexia, that part of the system is broken. So whatever it is, the brain representation of spelling and how you pronounce letter strings is still pretty intact. In this one patient I was mentioning, MP, it was very intact. She was great. She could pronounce lots of words and non-words aloud just fine. She could not pronounce ones like B-R-O-A-D, and if she tried to, she would say broad. So the theory is surface dyslexia results in damage to that one part of the triangle that goes through semantics. And the interesting thing about service dyslexic patients is their knowledge of the meanings of words is in fact impaired. These are people who have had damage to a part of the brain where the representation that is crucial to the meanings of words, such that they cannot make use of that in reading where it's needed, in reading certain kinds of words like broad. So, long story short, it's not, many parts of the reading system are still, the typical reading system are still intact, but there's one of the pathways that's actually been knocked out or partially knocked out by the brain injury.
I think that explanation of where it happens in the triangle is particularly useful. It, you know, it helps us visualize what it is that's going on there.
In the MP case, if I could just finish it, I do describe it in the book, but you know, MP was really a pure and interesting case she was studied for many years because she was great at reading words aloud, except for the low frequency exceptions. And the brain injury had utterly destroyed her knowledge of the meanings of words. She would read aloud and she did not know what the words meant. She was a reading machine. So that told us that, well, the meanings of words are really relevant to pronouncing some words, the atypical ones, the ones with the irregular spelling sound correspondences, the words like broad.
Okay, on to our next question. I think this is what it means. They're talking about a student who has memorized words. I think that means they've learned whole words by paired association. And later, once they've been taught to decode, will they decode those same words after they've had decoding instruction? Or is their default to just, at least for the words where they've been taught by rote memory to memorize the whole word, will they always just read it that way?
Well, this is a question about brain plasticity.
Yeah.
So, you know, given that you've learned something, is it frozen or can it be further modified? So if a child in one classroom is being learned to, you know, essentially what we call barking at words, you know, take the spelling and just learn the associated pronunciation, which you can do with a lot of practice, but it's not easy. It's slow. And then they go to the next year to a classroom where somebody taught them phonics, spelling, sound kinds of knowledge. Could they change, or are they locked into what they got the year before? Children's brains are very plastic. These kinds of things are very modifiable. The window has not closed, and indeed, there's no default here. Everything can be in children who are learning to read, or the first several years of reading. That system is highly plastic. It is one that is undergoing rapid changes, and indeed can be reorganized by changing instruction, changing experience. So no, they won't default. You can always pick things up, move things around. You can structure the child's experience to kind of change the way they do things.
Yeah, that's good to know. And now here's a question about, apparently you've been on, people have been talking about you on social media, saying that you endorse teaching phonemic awareness by using letters. And some people think that just doesn't make any sense. How could he say that? You know, there is a lot of disagreement about this in the field. What do you think about teaching phonemic awareness? Should it be done with letters, with no letters, a combination of the two?
Yeah, I think this, first of all, social media are just impossible for people interested in reading, because everything turns into a war, and things devolve into unpleasantness really rapidly. And I feel like people lose track of the fact that we're not trying to one up each other. We're trying to figure out what's going to work for kids who are learning to read.
And if something works for you to instruct kids with, great. Like, and if somebody else has a different approach, you know, we're not trying to like pit our approaches against each other.
I don't think social
all the-
media are the place to really work these things out because there's a loss of subtlety. So I think we're going to have to do some more explaining about this, because I really think, although phonemic awareness is a term people talk about, it's defined all over, everywhere. The question of how kids develop phonemic awareness is actually, I think, really not what were the kinds of things that we should do to promote the development of this knowledge. I think is really something that hasn't been resolved, and I think isn't closely connected to the science. So maybe this was a part of the book that was hard to understand, and we should try to frame it differently. But here's what phonemes are. Phonemes are not just properties of speech. They originate in speech. Kids begin to develop a notion of phoneme from spoken language. So when you're playing rhyming games with the kid, book, look, and so on, the overlap between those words is helping the kid figure out that there's a sound at the beginning. That sound at the beginning of book and look, those are phonemes. So through spoken language, the use of spoken language, kids start to break words apart, and they begin to develop a preliminary sort of nascent partial representation of what we're going to later will later turn into phonemes. The thing that really creates the idea that the word bat consists of 3 phonemes is exposure to spelling. So it's a combination of the two. It originates in spoken language, and children's spoken language. That's why, for example, the development of phonemic awareness is related to vocabulary size. Why? Because the more varied words you have, the more the child begins to discover the parts, and the parts are going to include things that we're going to call phonemes. But to really get the idea of phoneme involves exposure to print. The research on that is really not ambiguous in my view. And in the book, I mentioned some of the studies. So if you're illiterate and you're not exposed to print, do people who does your spoken language, do you have phonemic awareness? Well, if it's just a property of speech, then people who are illiterate should be able to identify phonemes. If it's related to exposure to print, people who are illiterate should have difficulty recognizing phonemes. Those studies have been done. What happens is that people who are illiterate who are asked to do phonemic awareness kinds of tasks, they don't get 0 right, but they perform very, very poorly. And that's consistent with what I was just describing. You kind of get a preliminary rough idea of what some phonemes are from speech, and even illiterate people get that. But to really get the idea that there are 3 segments, 3 phonemic segments, parts in a word like bat, that depends on exposure to print. So the people who are saying you should be able to teach kids phonemic awareness without connecting it to print, I think the research says they're wrong. Exactly how to link the two, of course, is an important question. But I am quite confident that methods that draw attention to the sound structure of words using standard sorts of phonemic awareness kinds of, spoken language games and so on, that also couple it to the way the words are spelled are it is far more effective than just treating phonemes as units of speech. They're not. They're kind of a mixture of speech and print.
It's that concept. And I know that older kids who I get to tutor who really are non-readers. At first, when you try to explain phonemic awareness, if you were to do just sound, just auditory activities, they have a hard time understanding the concept. But then if you do it with a word and manipulate the letters, then you can kind of step it down and use manipulatives with no letters, but still shows you the segmentation. And then they can eventually get it so that they can hear it just auditorily, but they do need that. It's the concept that I find that they're missing. They don't get what you're talking about until they experience it in the context of a word. And then it always works both ways, so that as you're working on phonemic awareness and working on some of the upper levels, what good is it going to do unless you use it when you're doing spelling?
Oh, I know. So, I mean, so first of all, one of the things, again, this gets back to one of my favorite themes, which is you have to think about where the kid is in development. I mean, at the end, when the kid has learned the stuff, well, then you can just say to them, how many phonemes are, what are the phonemes in the word sat? And they'll get it. They'll get it right. But that's not where they started. And the question is, how do you get there? And the way that you get there is through some combination of knowledge of spoken language, knowledge of spoken words, and coupling it to their alphabetic representations, because that's what the alphabet does. It's representing phonemes.
I wonder if this is another issue of adults versus kids, and we can do phonemic awareness as adults, as readers, we can do phonemic awareness tasks in the dark. But the reason we can do that is because of our experience with print, and we aren't making that connection, maybe that's the thing that has to happen for kids to be able to do sure, the goal could be to get to phonemic awareness in the dark activities, but print needs to be in there.
Yeah.
So
absolutely.
Here's a burning question, and this is probably the most common question I get from people who have read your book for the first time, and this first time they've heard about statistical learning, and they want to know, how does that relate to learning to read? And how much do you go the route of very explicit instruction? How much do you swing way over to the other end and have everything be constructivist discovery? Or do you hit somewhere in the middle and have some guided discovery of things? It's just, do you rely on statistical learning to a greater or lesser extent? It's hard to say because classrooms are so different. Some classrooms rely entirely on constructivist learning, and some classrooms do very explicit instruction. So it's hard to say, should you do more or less, without knowing what kind of classroom you're talking about. But how we need to go into the details of teaching the structure of language, and how much will kids just kind of pick up through statistical learning?
Well, they're going to pick it up if they have the relevant sorts of experience. And so, they're not going to pick it up if they don't have the learning opportunities. So it's not just something you can take for granted. I mean, and there are ways of structuring kids' experience to promote statistical learning. But let me just try to deal with the central question. Look, all of these things are eventually questions of fact, and there is some research on these questions. But right now, I would just appeal to something a little bit more general, which is most of what you do when you read words, and we're granting that reading words isn't all there is to reading, but it's an important foundational element. You're supposed to do that like it's a reflex. You're supposed to be able to do that without thinking. You're supposed to be able. The goal is to be able to look at the word and get that it's the word book, like that. So, and most of the knowledge that we're using when we read isn't something that we can verbalize. So, all the lists of spelling sound correspondences and phonics rules and stuff like that, they don't cover the whole language. They cover a small varying subset of cases. So my point is, it's supposed to be implicit. It's supposed to be automatic. It's supposed to be something that the kid does quickly so that they can get on with the task of understanding a sequence of words and ultimately a text. Now, what I see in a lot of curricula is a huge amount of explicit instruction where the kid is taught the rules, say, for pronouncing words or the rules for spelling certain kinds of sounds. And it might be 100 rules, it might be 47 rules. Everybody's got their list of rules. And as you say, curricula vary. In some classrooms, none of this is taught. In some classes, a lot of this is taught. And the question I would ask is, look, the kid does not need to be able to tell you how something is done. They don't need to be able to tell you what the rules of pronouncing words in English are. The kid just needs to be able to do it. And when you're teaching the kid explicit rules, how is that actually going to turn into what we want, which is this kind of automatic, rapid, fluent? People talk about how hard it is to teach fluency. How can the child learn to read words fluently and accurately using explicit knowledge of the patterns and that are described using, in verbal terms? In other words, giving the child a verbal description of a rule for pronouncing English seems to me to move in the exact opposite direction we want the kid to be going in, which is one where they don't think about it at all. They just do it. So this is an impression. It's not support. I haven't looked at, it's not a study. I tend to think that people are really overdoing it massively in terms of how much explicit instruction they do, whether it's rules for pronouncing, letter sound correspondences, or rules for how syllables are governed, are constructed, or rules for anything else. The child does not need to be a linguist. The child does not need to be able to tell you how the language works or the writing system works. The child needs to be able to look at the spelling of the word and get as quickly as possible to its meaning and try to integrate that with the context, linguistic and otherwise. Now, what's the right balance? Looks like to me a little bit of explicit instruction kind of promotes a lot of the implicit learning that kids are doing on their own. And I would say that a lot of research that I'm currently doing is trying to determine what is the optimal way to balance those things. What I would say is I think there's way too much emphasis on explicit instruction about what the patterns are. That's not, the goal isn't for the child to be able to tell you that. The goal is to lead them into the knowledge that allows them to use those correspondences for the purpose of understanding words and texts.
It's one thing that occurred to me after I had been tutoring for a couple of years. When you go through a training program, you have to learn you learn all about the structure of language. You learn all those rules. The thing is that it took me a while to realize is just because I learned them all didn't mean I needed to teach them all. And you learn them all so that if a child is having trouble, you can figure out where the problem is maybe they're a student who is not very good at statistical learning or has something, something interfering with their statistical learning, and you need to give them a little more explicit help. But, you as a teacher, you have to learn the structure so that you can analyze what's going on with your students and help them as they need help. One thing that I see sometimes people arguing against explicit instruction is because they don't know the structure. It's impossible for them to do that explicit instruction because they don't know the rules. They don't know how English is structured at all. There's just no excuse for that. But if you do know the structure, is your job is to guide them into, recognizing the patterns, not repeating back, verbatim some definition of a particular type of syllable. That was another question that might be by the same person. Do kids need to be explicitly taught the types of syllables, like closed syllable? What's the structure? What kind of vowel sound does it indicate? I mean, all of that is important, but you can do it in a way that's not so, I don't know.
It's not teaching the kid the meta knowledge, the description of the system. It's leading them into being able to recognize and use these patterns on their own, and in this sort of unconscious automatic way. I'd say a couple of things. One is, I think those rules are all convenient fictions because, of course, no one agrees about the rules of English. And the reason is because it's not rule governed ultimately. And when we talk about those rules, they might be useful shorthand kind of things, but there's a danger of taking them too seriously. They're kind of useful fictions. They're tools to describe something as a rule, but actually, I don't think that's how our knowledge of words and the structure of words and orthography, phonology, meaning, I don't think any of those things are represented as in the form of rules. Now, explicit instruction kind of, I hate to say it's a kind of scaffolding thing, right? It's you demonstrating something to a child enough times so that they begin to be able to do the same thing on their own. And luckily, the writing system, the written form, the way the language is written, has patterns in it, and kids are really good at picking up on patterns. So there is some ideal balance between the two, and it's probably going to depend on where the kid is in development, and it's going to also depend on individual differences, like who's having trouble and why are they having trouble, and maybe some kids do need some additional explicit instruction. In general, though, I'm really concerned because I think a lot of phonics curricula in particular are way heavy on the explicit instruction, and that ultimately may not pay off as much as it should, because it's that explicit knowledge isn't really the point. About the syllables, I know there are people who absolutely are committed to this, and the question that always comes to mind for me is, what did people do before they actually identified the syllable types and taught them to kids? Did kids not learn to read? I can't list for you all those syllable types. I could go look them up. I think I know what syllables are and can use them. I should say again, all of these units are like.
I'm so bad at syllables. I'm a great reader, and I couldn't tell you how many, lots of words. I'm not sure how many syllables they have.
Linguists don't agree.
Yeah.
Linguists don't agree where the syllable boundary is in the word camel. Is it after the a? Is it after the m? Or is it ambisyllabic where the m is in both parts syllables? No one, people don't agree. So syllables are really messy units, and it's kind of another convenient fiction, So can kids learn to read without knowing how many syllable types are there? 5 or 6?
Oh, well,
I don't know.
There's 6. I've spent
Can you learn to read without knowing the 6 syllable types? Yes. Could people do it for hundreds of years? Yes. Is it a necessary component of teaching kids to read? I don't think so.
No,
Uh,
I
eh,
do. think it
are there some kids for whom it might be beneficial because they are struggling and they need an alternative path? Maybe.
Yeah, I view it through a particular lens because all the kids I've worked with are the ones who have just failed to learn to read.
Right.
And they need that, and they need to understand the different structure and it helps them pronounce it. But the other thing is syllables are, I mean, there's a difference between a spoken syllable and the concept of a written syllable that they're two different concepts. They don't always align, so that creates a lot of confusion. But again, I just,
Depends on the kid, and I can grant that. Look, there are
Some
children
kids are
for
gonna
whom the
notice
standard
the pattern.
sorts of methods are not working. Go ahead, Molly.
No, I was just going to say, like I think the thing Mary is alluding to is, and that I think would align with what you've been saying, Mark, too, is that like, so there are these patterns. Maybe there aren't rules in English, and as a teacher, you need to know about the patterns, because if you can present instructional materials in a way that reveal the patterns to the kids kind of pick up on the patterns, that seems like a good way to learn. And that there might be kids for whom that kind of like revealing the pattern, implicitly learning is not enough. They need a little more to hang their hat on, a little more explicit, like pointing to, hey, here's a pattern. Do we notice this pattern? And that can help them clamp on.
Totally. And the Holy Grail is like having the evidence that about how to really balance these things given a kid who's at a particular level.
Mm-hmm.
yeah, it's all about what the teacher knows and is able to do to maximize the progress of each student, I think. And I do agree with Molly. I try not to use the term rule. I usually talk about generalizations or patterns because it's more like the reality of the way English really is. So there was a related question to this. It says many of our 3rd and 4th graders do not have, I think they mean phonological awareness in place or a strong grasp of phonics. Yet the thought from educational settings, I guess this is the setting that this person might work in, seems to be to teach grade level content during Tier 1 core instruction and teach remedial skills only during RTI time when they have intervention. How should we best serve the students who did not receive a strong foundation beyond grade 2? And how can you address that gap closure? So, here we're talking about kids in 3rd and 4th grade. Even if they've had maybe they have had really poor instruction, or maybe they've had pretty good instruction, but they're the ones that couldn't make it on the more implicit side of learning and needed more explicit instruction and didn't get it. But what do we do?
What do you think? I mean, I think I want to hear your answer, because all I can say is this child needs enough time and instruction to be able to gain these skills, or to be able to gain a workaround. I mean, if it's going to be a child who's not responding to excellent instruction related to, learning about orthography, phonology, the ways that they were related, phonemic awareness and all of that, if the child is not responding to those things and they've gotten adequate instruction of that sort, does that merit looking at a workaround? Yeah, I would think so. But I can't speak to how to spend the class day or what to do with these kids, other than to say they need to have more time to be able to get this knowledge if they haven't already. If it has been inadequate instruction, they need the time to actually get it. And they may in fact need people who can work with them and give them alternative strategies, alternative approaches, or make things explicit that other kids didn't need to have explicit. This person seems to be describing a situation in which the kid's never going to catch up because they're not where's the opportunity to catch up here?
Yeah, the way it's described, that child is never going to catch up. In 3rd and 4th grade, you're already past your prime time for doing this, and you're into it. It's really, well, not too late. I mean, you can always teach.
No, it isn't.
It's never too late, but the further on you get, the more competition there is for your time, the more content there is to learn about stuff in the world, and the less time there is to spend on these foundational skills. So if you're in 3rd and 4th grade, it's kind of like your last ditch attempt to really put a lot of time in it and see if you can get them brought around. If you're trying to do it in middle school and high school, it's still not too late to learn, but think of what they have to give up to devote enough time to get there.
Yeah, I think, so what I think is that if the school is not making it possible, if there isn't enough time, or there isn't enough instruction, or there isn't the personnel, or for whatever reason the school is not adequately helping the kid who is in 3rd grade and still hasn't learned these things, this is a place where people who have the resources have to look outside the school. You may not be able to rely on the school to do the right thing. And then you will have to send your child, you should send your child to Mary or to someone else who can provide the appropriate and kinds of experiences that will get this child to the place they need to be. Unfortunately, this is where the educational system magnifies differences in socioeconomic status, in income, and how well off the child is. But if the child is in 3rd grade and struggling, and you're asking, how can we do this within the school? It's not clear that the school system are prepared to allocate the time and have the expertise to really help the child, because and that's what motivates people to seek additional instruction and support outside the school.
Yeah, I
And that's not fair, but I think it's absolutely necessary in some cases.
Definitely not fair. And I think the big lesson from this, even though we are talking about what do you do for that older kid now who's already behind, the big lesson is in kindergarten and 1st and 2nd grade, you better have a darn good core program where, you know, you've got the vast majority of your kids are learning their skills as they, on schedule. And, you know, they need to be on schedule, and you need to have enough of them getting that from the core program so that there are few enough kids in intervention that you can really spend some time with them and move them forward. And it's
absolutely,
it's just, you have to work on that prevention at the lower grades.
Keep the kid from going off the rails, and it can be done for most kids.
Yeah, I know. It's sad when you see that. And but I do know from, you know, I've taken kids who are juniors in high school and they don't know how to read, and you can still teach them how to read.
Yes.
And, you know, and actually when they're that old, they have certain cognitive abilities that have developed. They progress pretty quickly, you know, as long as they're given a logical sequence and you know what you're doing with them, they can progress pretty quickly. But I've never seen them get that in a school. It's always been an outside situation, and then it's just, you know, it's not fair, you know.
No, it should make people angry.
And
the kid needs to be taught right in the first place, and success shouldn't depend on whether you have the resources to seek outside help.
Right. That's the one thing that I like about the Children's Dyslexia Centers, is that you may have to wait to get in, but then it's free.
Yeah.
And you know, it's kind of a leveler for a lot of kids. But why do those centers in Wisconsin have 2 to 3 year waiting lists? You know, it's like, because it's not taken care of. And I think there's a tendency in school to pass from within a grade. They're not learning it in the core program. Well, I'm not going to change anything I'm doing in the core program. I'll just send them to intervention and it'll be handled there. Or you get to the end of the year, well, we'll send it on to next year. They'll get it next year, or they'll go to summer school and they'll get it there. Or then if you get to a certain point, well, now we'll just take them and put them in special education and they'll get it there, not realizing that a lot of times there's less expertise in special education than there was with the reading interventionist in general education. So it's this is the thing that I hate to talk about reading, because it brings up all of our shortcomings.
We can do better, and I think people want to do better, and there's interest in finding ways to do better. And then there's inertia or entrenched interests that make it hard to change. But kids can be helped. Kids can succeed. It's a question often of having the right expertise, having a teacher and a curriculum that are really doing the right support kinds of things, or having access to additional resources. There are so many kids who are succeeding because their parents can pay for special instruction, and so they aren't dependent upon the public school or the schools, and that's really not right. So the positive message is, yeah, we can do better. We definitely can do better, and hopefully people are really motivated to deal with these issues.
Well, I'm thinking that might be a good place to kind of wind things up here. I think we, through answering, there are some questions that we didn't address directly, but they were addressed in the context of another question. So I think we've pretty much covered the burning questions that our participants had left over at the end of the book club. I just hope everybody who's watching has enjoyed having these discussions as much as we've enjoyed having discussions with you all. And I want to take one more opportunity to thank both Mark and Molly for sharing their time and sharing their expertise. And it's not every researcher that goes out of their way to make this information understandable and accessible and useful to practitioners. And so we just really appreciate that attitude and the cooperation that we get going from research into practice.
Well, I want to thank you too, and also the teachers and educators who participated for the work they do.
Yeah, they did an awesome job. They had great questions. They stuck with it. And
oh, I meant in the classroom.
Yes, I know. And they just and especially this year and last spring, the last 12 months, it's been,
oh my.
I don't know how they can keep track of anything. So hats off to all those teachers out there who are trying their best and trying to learn more so that they can help more kids. So that's what it's all about, really. So with that, I think we will sign off.